Historians do not agree on what happened to the princes in the tower, and recent research suggests at least one of them may have survived. That probably contradicts everything you think you know about this story. The hunchbacked villain uncle, the smothered children, the bodies hidden beneath a staircase. Shakespeare gave us this narrative 400 years ago, and we've been repeating it ever since like it's established fact. It isn't. The story that Richard III murdered his nephews was written by the people who replaced him, the Tudors, and they had every reason in the world to blacken his name. The actual evidence? It points to multiple suspects with motive, means, and opportunity to eliminate two children who stood in the way of their ambitions. So let's do something different. Let's examine this case the way a prosecutor would. 4 suspects, no verified confession, no bodies that can be definitively identified, and a 500-year cover-up that masquerades as history. The verdict is yours to render. But first, you need to understand the moment everything fell apart. The spring of 1483 arrived in England with the usual seasonal rains that turned muddy roads into quagmires. King Edward IV had ruled for over 2 decades with a combination of military prowess and political cunning, but his body had been ravaged by excess. Too much food, too much wine, too many women. On April 9, 1483, Edward IV died at Westminster Palace. He was 40 years old. His death shattered everything. The heir to the throne was 12-year-old Edward, Prince of Wales, soon to become Edward V. The boy was being raised at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, under the guardianship of his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. His younger brother Richard, Duke of York, was only 9. Their father had left behind a contested will, and a court immediately divided between 2 hostile factions, the Woodvilles, who controlled the heir, and the old nobility led by Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the dead king's surviving brother, the boy's uncle. Here's where it gets complicated. Richard of Gloucester was a loyal servant to his brother Edward IV throughout the Wars of the Roses. He commanded armies. He governed the turbulent north of England. He wasn't a physically imposing man. The discovery of his skeleton centuries later revealed severe scoliosis that curved his spine dramatically. But he was respected, even feared. Edward IV had named Richard as Lord Protector in his will, entrusting his brother with governance until young Edward V came of age. This should have been straightforward. It wasn't. The Woodvilles sensed that Richard might strip them of their influence, so they moved fast, trying to rush the young king to London for an immediate coronation, hoping to present the Lord Protector with a done deal. Richard moved faster. At Stony Stratford, he intercepted the royal party, arrested Earl Rivers and the Woodville faction, and took custody of his nephew. The first blood had been drawn. The boy king entered London on May 4, 1483, riding beside his uncle in what should have been a triumphant procession. The streets were decorated, the crowds cheered, but those close to the prince noticed he seemed subdued, frightened even. His mother and younger brother had fled to sanctuary at Westminster Abbey the moment they heard about Rivers's arrest, barricading themselves within the sacred precinct where even royal power couldn't easily reach. The coronation was set for June 22nd. It would never happen. Young Edward V was installed in the Tower of London, which was a royal residence at the time, not just a prison, to await his crowning. In early June, Richard demanded that Elizabeth Woodville surrender her younger son from sanctuary. The Queen refused. She'd already seen her adult sons arrested and her brother seized. She wasn't about to hand over her 9-year-old. But Richard was insistent. He sent Cardinal Bouchier, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to convince her. The cardinal assured Elizabeth her son would be safe, that the king needed his brother for company, that sanctuary was no place for a prince. Whether she believed him, or simply recognized she had no real choice, Elizabeth finally relented. Young Richard was extracted from Westminster and delivered to the Tower to join his brother on June 16, 1483. The two boys were together. They would never be seen in public again. Within days of securing both princes, Richard dropped his bombshell. A preacher named Ralph Shaw delivered a sermon at St. Paul's Cross on June 22nd, the very day the coronation had been scheduled, declaring that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. The basis? Edward, before his secret marriage to Elizabeth, had allegedly been pre-contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler. Under canon law, a pre-contract was as binding as marriage. Edward's later marriage was therefore bigamous. His children were illegitimate. The sermon thundered its conclusion. Edward V was no king at all. He was a bastard with no claim to the throne. The true heir was Richard of Gloucester himself. Parliament formalized this claim in the Titulus Regius of 1484, an act that declared the princes illegitimate and invested Richard with the crown. Richard III was crowned on July 6, 1483. His nephews remained in the Tower, no longer princes, but merely the bastard sons of a dead king. And then, they simply stopped appearing. The Italian observer Dominic Mancini was in London during these events. He wrote that after Richard took the crown, the princes were withdrawn into the inner apartments of the Tower proper, and day by day began to be seen more rarely behind the bars and windows, till at length they ceased to appear altogether. Mancini's account has problems. He spoke no English, had no knowledge of English governance, and was an agent of France, a hostile foreign power. His observations were second-hand at best, filtered through translators and informants. But he captured the essential horror. Two children, increasingly confined, increasingly invisible, until they were invisible entirely. They were last recorded alive playing in the Tower Gardens between June and August 1483. After that, silence. No verified sighting, no body, no grave. Just an absence that screamed. Now, the traditional narrative says Richard III had them murdered. He needed them dead because their existence threatened his throne. So he gave the order. His agents smothered the boys in their beds, buried them secretly within the Tower, and that was that. Simple, clean, and almost certainly wrong. Let's examine the evidence against Richard III, the evidence that convicted him in the court of public opinion, and watch it crumble. The primary source blaming Richard III is Thomas More's The History of King Richard III, written between 1513 and 1518, 30 years after the events it describes. More was a child during the prince's disappearance. He wasn't an eyewitness, and he was writing under the Tudor regime, the people who had replaced Richard, the people who had every political reason to justify their seizure of power by turning their predecessor into a monster. More's account reads like Gothic horror, complete with dramatic dialogue he couldn't possibly have known, complete with physical descriptions that have been proven false. He claimed Richard III had a withered arm caused by witchcraft. When Richard's skeleton was discovered under a Leicester parking lot in 2012 and subjected to modern forensic analysis, there was no evidence of any arm withering whatsoever. None. This wasn't a minor error in transmission. This was fabrication, a detail invented to make Richard seem cursed and monstrous. If More was wrong about the withered arm, what else was he wrong about? The other major source is Polydore Vergil, an Italian scholar explicitly employed by Henry VII as his official historian. Vergil's purpose was to legitimize Tudor rule and cast Richard III as a tyrant whose overthrow was divinely sanctioned. This wasn't neutral history. This was propaganda commissioned by the people who benefited from Richard's vilification. Virgil named Sir James Tyrrell as the murderer, acting on Richard's direct orders. For centuries, this was accepted as fact. But consider the nature of this evidence. Tyrrell allegedly confessed to the murder under interrogation in 1502, nearly 20 years after the princes disappeared. He was being held in the Tower at the time, accused of treason. The interrogation almost certainly involved torture or its threat. Confessions extracted under such circumstances are worthless. People will say whatever their interrogators want them to say to make the pain stop. And here's the damning part. The original document containing Tyrrell's confession has never been produced. No one has ever seen it. We have only the word of Tudor chroniclers that it ever existed. This isn't a smoking gun. This is hearsay about a document that may have been fabricated entirely. Yes, the circumstantial case against Richard seems strong. He had motive. The princes were rival claimants threatening his throne. He had opportunity. They were in his custody in the Tower. They disappeared on his watch. But motive and opportunity don't prove guilt. They establish possibility. Consider Elizabeth Woodville's behavior. The boy's own mother. She made peace with Richard III in 1484 and trusted him with the safety of her surviving daughters. Stop and think about that. If Elizabeth Woodville genuinely believed Richard had murdered her sons, would she have entrusted her daughters to him? Would she have left sanctuary and reconciled with the man who had allegedly smothered her children? The standard explanation is desperation, political isolation. But desperation doesn't explain warmth. The historical record suggests Elizabeth's rapprochement with Richard was genuine enough that her daughters were treated with honor at his court. This makes no sense if Richard was a child killer whose guilt was known or even suspected by the Queen. Thomas More named Miles Forrest as one of the men who physically carried out the murder, supposedly smothering the boys with pillows. Yet Richard III later granted Forrest's widow and son an annuity. Why would you provide for the family of a man who murdered children on your orders? Some historians have argued Forrest may have been rewarded for protecting the princes, not killing them. The traditional narrative can't accommodate this evidence, so it's simply ignored. And then there's Henry VII's Bill of Attainder against Richard III, passed after the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. This document accused Richard of numerous crimes and justified his overthrow. If Richard had murdered the princes, an act of supreme villainy that would have horrified all of Christendom, surely this would have been the centerpiece. Instead, the bill makes no definitive mention of the princes at all. It uses only the vague phrase, shedding of infants' blood. Why the ambiguity? Why not state plainly that Richard murdered his nephews, if this was known to be true? The most logical explanation is that Henry VII didn't know what had happened to the princes. Or worse, he knew something that made direct accusation politically inconvenient. Which brings us to suspect number 2, Henry VII. If the Richard did it narrative was constructed by the Tudors, we have to ask an uncomfortable question. Who benefited from Richard's vilification? The answer is obvious. Henry VII seized the throne from Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 1485. His claim to the crown was extraordinarily weak. He descended from the illegitimate Beaufort line and had spent most of his life in exile. The only way to strengthen his position was to present his seizure of power as liberation, his ambition as divine justice. Richard had to be a monster, so Henry could be a savior. Every crime attributed to Richard served Tudor political interests. But here's the thing. Henry VII had his own motive for wanting the princes dead. They were rival claimants whose claim to the throne was far stronger than his. Even if they were technically illegitimate under the titulus regius, that act could be repealed, and Henry eventually did repeal it. Their legitimacy could be restored with a stroke of the pen. As long as the princes lived, they were threats, and Henry had opportunity. The princes were last definitively seen in the summer of 1483. Richard III died at Bosworth in August 1485, 2 full years later. What if the princes were still alive when Henry took the throne? What if they disappeared not under Richard's watch, but under Henry's? Consider Henry's behavior after he became king. He never produced the princes' bodies. If Richard had murdered them and Henry had found the bodies, displaying them would have been the ultimate propaganda coup. Proof positive that Richard was a child-killing monster and Henry was the righteous avenger. Instead, nothing. No bodies, no graves, no public mourning. He never formally accused Richard of the murder. The Bill of Attainder's vague language about infant's blood is the closest we get. This makes no sense if Henry had evidence of Richard's guilt. And then there's Elizabeth of York. Henry married the prince's sister. This was supposed to unite the houses of York and Lancaster and strengthen his claim. But think about it. Why marry her if the princes were dead and no longer a threat? Elizabeth's claim to the throne derived from her position as Edward IV's daughter, but so did the prince's claims as his sons. If the princes were dead, Elizabeth's value as a bride diminished significantly. Her brothers' deaths would have made her a figure of tragedy, yes, but not a political necessity. Unless the princes might still be alive. Unless marrying their sister was a way to neutralize any future claims they might make. Henry's terror over the pretenders who emerged during his reign tells us something important. Perkin Warbeck claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes. He appeared in the 1490s and spent years gathering support from European courts. Henry VII reacted with paranoid intensity, deploying spies, diplomatic pressure, and eventually military force to destroy this threat. If Henry knew for certain the princes were dead, why such fear? A man who knows his enemies are in the grave doesn't panic when someone claims to be their ghost. He simply produces proof of death and the imposter is exposed. Henry couldn't do that. He couldn't prove the princes were dead because he didn't have their bodies, or because he couldn't afford to reveal how he came to have them. Some historians have pointed to Henry VII as the most logical suspect. He had motive. He had opportunity. If the princes survived into his reign, he controlled the narrative afterward. And his behavior suggests a man with something to hide, not a man confident in his predecessor's guilt. But Henry VII isn't the only alternative suspect. Let's talk about his mother, Margaret Beaufort. History remembers her as the pious mother of the Tudors, devoted to her son, the woman who prayed and schemed in equal measure to see Henry on the throne. But beneath that maternal veneer was one of the most ruthless political operators of the 15th century. She had spent decades, maneuvering to advance her son's claim. She married strategically. She cultivated alliances carefully. She played a long game while exiled and marginalized, never losing sight of her ultimate goal, her son as King of England. Margaret was intimately involved in the Buckingham Rebellion of 1483, the first major uprising against Richard III. This rebellion is fascinating because of its timing. It began in October 1483, just months after the princes were last seen. And its original purpose seems to have been to rescue the princes and restore Edward V to the throne. But that's not what happened. Somewhere in the planning stages, the rebellion's goal shifted. Instead of restoring Edward V, it became about placing Henry Tudor on the throne. The princes were simply written out of the equation. This only makes sense if the conspirators believed the princes were already dead, or would be dead by the time the rebellion succeeded. And Margaret Beaufort was at the center of this conspiracy. Did she know something? Did she do something? She used her physician, Lewis Caerleon, as a go-between to coordinate with Elizabeth Woodville. We know she was actively planning her son's path to power. We know the rebellion pivoted from rescuing the princes to replacing them. Margaret's ambition was legendary, even among her contemporaries. She had waited her entire life for the chance that finally came in 1485. The princes stood in her way. Then, suddenly, they didn't. Some historians have speculated that Margaret may have ordered the princes' deaths, or at least facilitated them, to clear the path for her son. It's speculation. There's no documentary evidence directly implicating her. But the circumstantial case is uncomfortable enough that it can't be dismissed. She had motive. She had connections to people with access. She had demonstrated throughout her life that she would do whatever was necessary to advance her son's cause. And the history that exonerated her? Written by the dynasty she helped create. Now, the fourth suspect, the one who actually held the keys. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham was Richard III's closest ally during the 1483 power grab. He supported Richard's seizure of the young king, helped orchestrate the illegitimacy claim, and was rewarded handsomely. Money, lands, positions of power. He was also Constable of the Tower, which gave him direct access to the princes. Read that again. The man who controlled the Tower during the summer of 1483, the summer the princes disappeared, was the Duke of Buckingham. He had physical access to the boys that even Richard III would have had to go through him to achieve. And then, in October 1483, Buckingham turned against Richard, led the rebellion that bears his name, got captured and executed for treason. Why would Richard's closest allies suddenly rebel against him? One theory? Buckingham killed the princes on his own initiative, perhaps hoping to destabilize Richard's regime and advance his own royal claims. Buckingham had a claim to the throne through descent from Edward III, weaker than the prince's claim or Henry Tudor's, but a claim nonetheless. When Richard discovered what Buckingham had done, the alliance shattered. There's a document in the College of Arms, one that explicitly names the prince's murderer, that accuses Buckingham. It states that the murder was be the vice, advice/devise of the Duke of Buckingham. This is documentary evidence pointing to Buckingham, not Richard. Buckingham had means. He controlled the Tower. He had motive, his own royal ambitions. He had opportunity, unrestricted access to the princes during the crucial months. And then he's conveniently dead before he can be interrogated, executed for treason in November 1483. Whatever Buckingham knew died with him. So, 4 suspects. Richard III, the uncle who seized the throne, Henry VII, the tutor who replaced him, Margaret Beaufort, the mother whose ambition knew no limits, and the Duke of Buckingham, the man who held the keys. Each has a case against them. None has a conclusive case for them. But here's where the story takes its strangest turn, because there's another possibility the traditional narrative doesn't want you to consider. What if the princes weren't murdered at all? What if at least one of them survived? Recent scholarship has taken the survival theories far more seriously than previous generations of historians. The reasons are compelling. We have no bodies. We have no eyewitness account of their deaths. We have no confession that can be verified. What we have is an absence, and absences can mean many things. Perkin Warbeck appeared in the 1490s claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger prince. He wasn't some random impostor. He was immediately accepted at the court of Margaret of Burgundy, who was the prince's aunt. She would have known her nephew. She proclaimed Warbeck genuine. He was received at the court of Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor. For nearly a decade, Warbeck was treated as a legitimate prince by some of the most sophisticated courts in Europe. Henry VII expended enormous resources to discredit and destroy him. He moved heaven and earth to capture and destroy Warbeck, eventually having him executed in 1499. The official Tudor line is that Warbeck confessed to being an impostor, that he was actually a boatman's son from Tournai. But confessions extracted under Tudor custody are suspect for the same reasons Tyrrell's confession is suspect. and there's no DNA evidence to prove or disprove Warbeck's identity. What's interesting is what Henry VII didn't do. He never produced the prince's bones. He never displayed their graves. He never provided definitive proof they were dead. If he had such proof, Warbeck would have been laughed out of every court in Europe. Instead, Warbeck was taken seriously by people who had every reason to know whether the real Richard of York was alive or dead. Perkin Warbeck was treated like a threat. Researchers including Philippa Langley and Dr. John Ashdown Hill have argued that the evidence for at least one prince surviving is stronger than commonly acknowledged. The fact that the prince's fate was never definitively established in their own era, when witnesses would still have been alive, when bodies could have been found, suggests the answer wasn't known. You don't spread rumors about murdered children for decades if you can simply show people where they're buried. The 1674 discovery complicates everything. During renovations to the Tower of London in 1674, nearly 200 years after the princes vanished, workmen found a wooden chest buried beneath a staircase. Inside were the bones of 2 children. Charles II, assuming these were the princes, had them reinterred in Westminster Abbey under a monument identifying them as the princes. Case closed? Not remotely. The bones were examined in 1933 by forensic experts of the era. Their conclusions were frustratingly inconclusive. The examination was conducted with 1930s technology. The examiners could not determine the precise age of the remains, could not date them to any particular century, and could not definitively determine whether they were male or female. These bones could be the princes. They could also be 2 other children who died in the tower at any point during its centuries as a prison. The tower saw plenty of death. 2 children's skeletons don't prove they're specific children. Modern DNA testing could potentially answer the question. We have living descendants of the prince's family. Comparative DNA analysis could establish whether these bones belong to the royal line. Westminster Abbey and the royal household have refused to allow testing. Multiple requests have been made, including by historians and by Richard III's modern defenders. All have been denied. The official position is that the bones should rest undisturbed, that reopening the urn would be disrespectful. The practical effect is that the mystery cannot be solved. The evidence that could exonerate or condemn Richard III sits in Westminster Abbey, untouchable. We could know the answer. We're not allowed to find out. And that leads us to the meta question, the question behind all the questions. Why do we believe what we believe about the princes in the tower? The answer is Tudor propaganda, and it's a masterclass in how history gets rewritten by winners. When Henry VII took the throne, he faced a legitimacy crisis. His claim was weak. He needed to justify his rule, and the easiest way to do that was to demonize the man he'd replaced. So the Tudors commissioned histories. They patronized writers who told the story the way they wanted it told. Thomas More, writing under Henry VIII, produced the Gothic horror version of Richard III that shaped all subsequent accounts. Polydore Virgil, paid by the crown, wrote the official Tudor narrative, and a century later, Shakespeare, writing under Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, transformed that narrative into cultural bedrock. Shakespeare's Richard III isn't history. It's Tudor propaganda transmuted into art. The withered arm, the hunchback, the scheming villain who murders his way to the throne. None of this matches the historical record. All of it served Tudor political interests. We've been living inside a 400-year-old lie. Modern defenders of Richard III have worked to rehabilitate his reputation. The discovery of his skeleton in 2012 added momentum to their cause. Here was the actual man, not the theatrical monster. Yes, he had scoliosis. No, he didn't have a withered arm. The physical evidence contradicted the Tudor propaganda. But rehabilitating Richard isn't the same as solving the mystery. Proving Richard wasn't a monster doesn't prove he was innocent of this specific crime. It just proves we shouldn't trust the sources that convicted him. The honest conclusion is this: we don't know what happened to the princes in the Tower. Richard III may have ordered their deaths. He had motive, he had custody. The crime occurred on his watch. But the evidence against him comes almost entirely from hostile sources writing decades later under a regime that needed him to be guilty. Henry VII may have ordered their deaths. He had motive. If the princes survived into his reign, he had opportunity. His behavior, never producing bodies, never formally accusing Richard, panicking over pretenders, suggests a man who couldn't prove the princes were dead. Margaret Beaufort may have orchestrated their deaths. Her involvement in the Buckingham Rebellion, her lifelong obsession with placing her son on the throne, and the suspicious pivot from rescue the princes to crown Henry Tudor all point toward her. The Duke of Buckingham may have murdered them on his own initiative. He controlled the Tower. He had his own ambitions. A contemporary source names him as the killer, and he was conveniently executed before he could explain himself. Or the princes may have survived, at least one of them. Smuggled out, hidden, emerging years later as Perkin Warbeck, or dying in obscurity somewhere in Europe, their identities never confirmed. 4 suspects, multiple theories, no consensus. The bones in Westminster Abbey might tell us the truth. Westminster Abbey and the royal household won't allow testing. What we know for certain is this: the story you were told, the story most people believe, was written by the Tudors. The people with the most to gain from blaming Richard III. The people who controlled the historical record for over a century after the events. The people whose descendants sat on the throne when Shakespeare penned his famous play. That's not history. That's a cover story. The next time someone tells you Richard III murdered the princes in the Tower, you can tell them the truth. Historians do not agree. The evidence is contradictory. The sources are compromised, and the mystery remains unsolved after 500 years. The princes vanished. Someone knows what happened. No one who knows is talking. And the bones that could answer the question sit in Westminster Abbey, sealed in a monument, waiting for a permission that may never come. Maybe that's the real crime. Not the murder, if there was a murder, but the cover-up. The 4 centuries of propaganda that taught us a lie and called it history. The refusal to test the evidence when the technology finally exists. We could know. We're not allowed to. Think about that the next time someone tells you the past is settled. The past is whatever the winners decide to write down. And the losers don't get to correct the record. Unless we do it for them. Subscribe for more stories like this.